Welcome, everyone, to Clifford Law Office's CLE program on wellness, Reimagining Wellness for Lawyers, Strategies to Thrive at Work and Life. We encourage the thousands joining us on the web to ask questions. Everyone watching is muted, so please type your questions into the Q&A window located on your screen. We will try to get to as many as we can at the end of Aaron Clifford's presentation. To enhance interactivity during the event, we will present a series of polling questions. These questions will be displayed above the Q&A window. When prompted, participants can respond by selecting their answers on their screens and clicking the Submit button. Please remember to exit full screen mode to view and engage with the polling questions effectively. The material for today's program are available for download on your screen. If you need technical assistance, please submit your request under the Tech tab located on the window on your screen. The program evaluation can be found on your screen just below the handouts. To qualify for continuing education credit in certain states, please click on the verification verification pop-ups that will appear on your screen randomly throughout the program. If your state does not require verification codes such as Illinois, you are not required to click on these links. A link to the CLE certification process will appear at the end of the program. An on-demand recording of this program will be available to you within 3 business days. And now I would like to turn the program over to Clifford Law Office's communication partner, Pam Menaker.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Pam Menaker. Now in our 18th year, Clifford Law Offices is very proud to once again offer a quality program of ethics credit in mental health and substance abuse, better known as professional responsibility credit in Illinois. This program is being offered across many states, so please check how your state identifies this CLE. All of us here at Clifford Law Offices are particularly proud that the firm's managing director, Aaron Clifford, is today's presenter, using her multiple degrees, including a law degree from DePaul and a master's degree in mental health counseling from Northwestern University. We are particularly proud also to tell you that Aaron's first book, Wellness Reimagined, a holistic approach to health, happiness, and harmony, hit USA Today's top 10 on its bestsellers list. She certainly has a lot to say on this subject. More than 2,700 lawyers are registered in what is believed to be the largest program of its kind in the country. So without further ado, I turn over the program now to Aaron Clifford. Aaron?
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining today. I'm so excited to be here with all of you and present a little wellness on something that is really important to me. So I entitled this program, Reimagining Wellness for Lawyers, Strategies to Thrive at Work and Life. And the reason I did that is, when I was writing my book, certainly lawyers were of top of mind for me. It's a community that I am part of and love working with. And I really wanted us to reimagine wellness in more of a holistic way. We spend a lot of time talking about physical wellness, but it's also about mental wellness, emotional wellness, and spiritual wellness. And so I'm hoping today that you'll get 1 or 2 tips that you can take away that'll really help add a little bit more wellness to your life. And I also spent a little bit of time in this program talking about how we as a legal community can add more wellness, whether that's in our law firms and organizations, the court system, and kind of together as we, are in bar organizations and spend time together. How can we really, as a culturally, find a little bit more wellness? And the reason that is just so important is because we know as attorneys that we are in one of the most stressful occupations in the US. In fact, in 2023, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics actually noted us as being the most stressful profession in the U.S. And, why is that? We all understand it, right? We're expected to perform at a high level and make critical decisions. We work under really tight deadlines. And of course, we grapple, right, with the constant demands of clients, colleagues, and the whole court system. And because of that, lawyers are at risk of suffering from burnout, as well as anxiety, depression, loneliness, and we show greater instances of substance use. And I also think an aspect of this is we are in a profession where we're in conflict all the time. And sometimes it can be really hard when we leave the office to turn that off when we come into our personal spaces. And so one way that lawyers can really build upon their wellness is by building their resilience, right? So if you see in this caption, right, I've got somebody kind of walking up the stairs. So that idea of resilience is we're always trying to move forward, right? It doesn't mean that we don't have challenges in life. We always do, right? Things come up at work, at home, things that are unexpected. But when we have resilience, which is the capacity to rebound from adversity, trauma, or stress, we can adapt more effectively. I really think about it as, kind of being that superhero, in disguise. You've got something that's going to carry you forward when you need it. And you might be looking at this photo and wondering why. So this is my version of Simone Biles. I absolutely love the Olympics. I've always liked gymnastics. And I was really impressed with her and also a lot of the other athletes when they were being interviewed, because they talked about, what? We have challenges when we go out there. We've had setbacks in our sports careers. But in order to move forward, we really had to find ways to build our resilience, whether that was through mindfulness, grounding, visualization, and really making self-care a priority. And we're going to talk about a lot of those things today. And why is it so important that lawyers build resilience? Well, when we look at the statistics, the lawyers usually rank 90% at the bottom 90% in the score on resilience, right? Which means that we are more defensive, we can be more easily wounded by rejection, criticism, and setbacks. And so it's so important that we do find avenues to build this resilience. And you might be thinking, well, why is that, Erin? Why are lawyers, kind of more at risk for struggling with their resilience? Well, again, it's what we do for a living, right? Kind of coming back to that idea of being in conflict a lot and having, such a, full career in life that, that work-life balance idea becomes difficult. And we do things every day that kind of poke holes at things, right? We actively examine people's thinking, we poke holes in arguments, we look at situations with more of a critical frame of mind. We're at, constant pressure to excel. And what happens, I notice when I work with attorneys, and something I've personally struggled with, is we sometimes turn this criticism, onto ourselves. And when we do that, it can really impact our resilience. So what can we do about that? So I have a quick question for you, and this is kind of going to outline what we're doing today. And so if anybody doesn't know where your polls are, remember the poll is above the question and answer section on your screen. But if you're in full screen mode, you might not see it. But I want to know, how do lawyers build resilience and persevere when faced with challenging times, right? Do they live according to their values and prioritize life domains? Do they set healthy boundaries and practice time management? Do they practice self-compassion and foster a positive mindset? Do they connect with loved ones and community, engage in non-negotiable self-care? Or is it a little combination of all the above? So I would love everybody to answer the poll. I have no idea who's answering what, so feel free to be anonymous here. All right, we're getting some answers, right? And as I'm looking, people are selecting different ones. We have a lot of people saying a combination of all of them. And of course, people kind of going into the different areas here. And here's the thing here. This is really our outline for today. When I think about, how we can build resilience as attorneys, it's really, it's individualistic, but it's also, usually a combination of these things, but there might be one or two that really do resonate with you. So, as we're going through, as I said, our program today, make sure you're starting to think about, what are avenues that can really help me build my resilience, get a little bit more wellness in all those different areas that I had mentioned. And so I want to introduce a new concept to you, what I like to call harmonious lawyering. And what do I mean by that? So, in my book that I wrote, I talk a lot about harmonious living. So I thought, well, how can we kind of use that concept for us as lawyers? So what I mean by that is not doing less or escaping the demands of lawyering, which are going to be there, right? This is not a 9-to-5 job. But we want to be able to stay in the game of lawyering more resilient, wiser, and feeling more whole, right? So all those 4 different areas of wellness we're really beginning to encompass. And so what are some avenues to do that? Well, the first thing is to really shift your mindset a little bit and strive for harmony and not balance. So I realize we talk a lot about in the wellness space, how do I have more work-life balance? Well, I personally think work-life balance is a total myth. Look at this tightrope, right? It reminds me of when I used to go to the circus with my dad and watch the acrobats up there. But here I have a lawyer walking this tightrope. And what happens if I even lean a teensy bit to one side, I might fall off. And we should not live our lives where we're feeling like that all the time, right? So, and it's very difficult, as we all know, to feel like we're having a certain percentage in each life domain. And, I work with and talk with a lot of lawyers all the time who actually really do enjoy their jobs. And that is a big part of their identity. But it doesn't mean we can't find ways to weave in our other lifestyle areas and life domains. And so that's really, to me, what that harmonious work-life harmony is all about. And a good way to determine, what are some areas that you might need to spend a little bit more time in, or what are some professional and personal and lifestyle goals you have, is really by taking a minute to step back and think about what are your values. I always tell people, lead with your values. Your values are your North Star. And, when is the last time, ask yourself, that you actually sat down and you thought about, what are my top 5 values? Because when we know what our values are, making decisions, it can become a lot easier. Because when we know what our values are, we're more likely to be able to have all of our different, life domains working together, right? Because we know that our values, they guide our decisions, they guide our actions and our thoughts. So when you're thinking about, where are you at now? Where do you want to go? How do you want to get there? A good way to do that is by thinking about what your values, your North Star, or perhaps another way of looking at it is, what are my top 5 priorities? If family for me is a big priority to me and I don't feel like I'm spending enough time with them, how can I find little avenues to weave that in? Even if it's, we're not going to have our phones at the dinner table at night, right? Simple ways to weave more of that in. And so the next slide, this is what I like to call my wheel of harmony. Some of you may have seen this before, but it's really that idea of harmonious living or harmonious lawyering, where the blending of all our life domains happens in a way that really does support our values and priorities and gives us the most life satisfaction. So when I look at this, we have, of course, our career domain and our finance domain, where we do spend a lot of time as attorneys, but we also have all these other things going on. And throughout the program today, I'm going to kind of note some of them, right? We have got our friends and family. So I always tell people, all the success in the world, it's not going to hug you back. So you want to make sure that you find ways to prioritize this. Community. When we look at blue zones, places in the world where people live the longest, the one thing that they all have in common isn't what they eat or how they exercise or practice mindfulness. It's really about that they're connected to a larger community. So if any of you are involved in bar organizations and have made like a community of friends, maybe you have a community at your local gym or in your neighborhood or school, country club, church, right? These are all communities. Also, our health and our self-care. Again, right? Health isn't just our physical health, it's also our mental and emotional health. And when it comes to self-care, and I put it in its own area on this graph because I think that self-care is really something we need to add in every day. So I'm going to give you some tips as we go to do that. And of course, we have personal development, right? And sometimes that taps into that professional development. As we go through life, it's really good to keep learning new things, right? That's great for our brain health. I think it's good too for enjoyment in life, right? Variety and learning is always great. Spirituality, Maybe you have an organized religion, or you get spirituality from nature, mindfulness. I also think spirituality is just being, self-compassionate and giving yourself grace, something we're going to talk about today, as well as contribution. How do you pay it forward in the world? That's a big way of putting your legacy forward. And of course, your attitude. If we don't have a good attitude and foster that positive mindset, it's going to be really difficult to build that resilience, because we all do go through challenging times. And so as you're looking at this, remember, you don't need to be, a 10 in all these areas. But the idea is, are there a couple areas that you feel like are really important to you? And maybe you want to find some ways that you can build, 2 or 3 of these areas out a little bit more at this time in your life. Because what your wheel of harmony looks like now is going to be very different as you move through life, and maybe you're at a different stage. And so if we want to live according to our values, if we want to spend time in the life domains that are important to us, we know that we have to have some boundaries in place. Now, this may seem counterintuitive to some of you, but limits liberate. And what do I mean by that? Always remember that limits liberate you, because if you have boundaries or rules in place, you will end up giving yourself freedom to live life on your own terms, the way that you want to live it. Because if we constantly do what other people want us to do and we don't have any boundaries, we're going to end up resenting things, right? And living a life that's not the one we necessarily want to live. And of course, right, there's always things that we have to do, and if we're personally, professionally, but there's also this in-between gray area. When I was being interviewed for my book recently, somebody asked me, how often should you say no more? And right off the cuff, and I guess I was trying to be a little shocking, I said 80%. And what I really was getting at there was all those extra things that you get asked to do. Now, I'm on a call with, a bunch of, lawyers. And so I'm sure a lot of us, high performing individuals, right, we get asked to do a lot of extra things. And sometimes it can be too much, right? Whether that's that extra, can you chair this committee? Can you join this board? Can you attend this extra social event? And maybe there's some certifications or classes you want to take. And so when we're thinking about all of these extra things, we really need to think about a few things. First off, what's your gut reaction? If somebody asks you to do something and your gut reaction is, I feel anxious, like the thought of it is just making me really stressed out, that's a sign, right? We want to make sure we're listening to those things. Also, is this something that fits in with your schedule right now? I always tell people, when somebody asks you to do something, whether it's something big, something small, you're allowed to give yourself a minute to think about it and really see, right? Does this work with my values? Does this work with my wheel of harmony? Does this work with my desired schedule? I got asked today if I would do something for a group, and it's something I'm actually very interested in, but I'm a little busy right now, right, with my job at Clifford Law. I also have my wellness coaching business, and I'm promoting my book. So I have a lot on my plate. And so, I'm going to have to turn this down. And, while that's sometimes hard for me because there's a part of me that feels bad, I also know that a no now is not a no forever. And I can communicate that, this is just a challenging time right now for me. I can't add anything to my plate. And, that is just, what's going to be helpful and support me, because otherwise I'm not only going to resent having this extra thing to do, but I'm not going to do it to the full of my abilities, which isn't fair to the organization or to me. So there's all these different kind of boundaries we set, right? And just to kind of highlight a few for time's sake, one of the things I did want to mention is that self-care boundary. We're going to talk about simple avenues to get self-care in today, but you've got to make that a priority if you want to add more self-care in. I know some attorneys that will literally block off their lunch hour, and that's just sacred to them, right? They need that time to either go get their workouts in, just sit and eat, run an errand, and it just helps them function more throughout the day. Also, like if you feel like, part of my new exercise routine is I'm going to go to the gym on a Wednesday. If you've got to go to an event on Tuesday night, and your buddy's like, hey, can we stop and grab an extra cocktail on the way home? Maybe that's not the best time because it'll impact your sleep and you won't get up and maybe make it to the gym the next day, right? So sometimes we've got to be, protective of our self-care boundaries. And of course, we have our social boundaries. A great way to think about this is how many things do you want to do a month? How many extra social things? You can apply this with, lawyer events, right? We get asked to go to a lot of events. How many feel good to you a month? It's really difficult to feel like you have to do everything. Again, that's not, even if you're trying to network, can you pick and choose what's important to you? And then, of course, our technology. This is one that I get asked about just so much. And so, of course, we are not required to be available 24/7. I know sometimes people in this profession feel like that, but I just believe that that's not even good from a productive standpoint for people. So a great way to communicate that is to, make sure you have your hours and your email signage. I know attorneys, when they get home at the end of the day, they will put their phone on do not disturb. They have a way for somebody to get a hold of them if it's an emergency. But, what is that signal, right? If I text that person, I'm going to see that do not disturb, and I'm going to know that, they're not going to get back to me till the next day. So there's all these different avenues that we can do to set boundaries in these areas, and many more too. And so a great way that can help us, manage our boundaries is really to have a little bit of time management in. So our next polling question, I would like to know, because I actually think when I do these programs, you are all the best experts. So if you could kind of share with the group here, what is your top time management strategy for becoming a more efficient and successful lawyer, right? Do you think that prioritizing your to-do list is helpful, whether that's, those sticky notes I put around my office or something more fancy like the Eisenhower matrix? Are you really good perhaps at managing email communications, right? We get lots and lots of emails. Do organizational tools help you, whether that's that desktop or phone calendar, smartphone app, project management software? Or are you someone who says, you know what, I get really productive when I just minimize distractions. I've got a chunk of time, I've got to work on a project, I'm going to minimize distractions. Or do you feel like you're good at delegating? And one thing I want to note too about delegating is, while it's really important, right, to delegate things at work, think about that, how that transfers into your home life. If you are really busy, sometimes we feel guilty, right, asking our partner, hey, can you stop at the Walgreens and just grab my prescription for me? Or, it's Christmas and you've got so much stuff going on, can I invite some girlfriends over to, help me like decorate with my kids, as opposed to feeling like I have to do everything myself, or are there services like I can outsource? I work with people a lot around nutrition, and sometimes, right, there's meal prepping, there are grocery services that you can outsource. So that's another way of thinking about delegation. And so when I look at this poll here, it looks like people are utilizing a lot of different areas, but a lot of people are using that prioritizing your to-do list, which is something I definitely do a lot too. But all of these are great ways if you're looking for something to try. And so, I like to think about it like this, the 4 P's of time management for lawyers, okay? So the first one is all about prioritizing, okay? And so that could be, breaking your tasks down into high, medium, and low, having a system that works for you, whether it is something, a little fancier, or you're just like, what, I've got a couple Post-it notes in front of me and I'm going to kind of prioritize them. I always recommend too, right, at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, that we check and see what our schedules are, because for that day, for the following day, because it can be really helpful just to kind of get that in our heads. What do I need to make sure I've got for the day? And then plan. How can you break down, your plan into smaller steps? And, I always recommend to giving yourself buffer time. We do a lot of stuff now online, so, a lot of times I'll see people will schedule Zooms like back to back, right? And why is that maybe not the best idea? Because if I don't even give myself, maybe I'm just saying like a 10-minute break in between my 2 Zooms, well, first off, one could go over, right? And then I'm showing up late for the second one. Also, I might need a minute just to like decompress, use the facilities, kind of get my notes in my mind together and ready for the next meeting. So sometimes just building in some of that buffer time can be really helpful. I'm working with an attorney individually right now, and she's been practicing for about 10 years. And she said, I've been thinking about that. And when I was in law school, when I used to go from class to class, I had like a 15-minute break. And she's like, I kind of need to add that in a little bit with some of my client meetings, because it's just getting, for me mentally, it's just getting overwhelming to just go back to back to back. So, that's, always thinking about that, as well as being prepared, right? What resources do I have to do different activities that I need for the day? And do I need to minimize distractions, right? And sometimes that might be as simple as just, closing your door. If you've got to do a Zoom deposition, I know at our firm, some people hang, little signs they had created outside their door, right? Because they want to make sure they can get their work done. It's quiet. You can also do that too. If you're like, I just need a chunk of time to return emails, great way to do that. And put that phone away. Sometimes if we're trying to get work done and we've got our phones next to us, or, we're just going looking at our Apple Watches, we can get distracted easily. And of course, we need to perform, right? Get that task, all those different tasks we have done. But again, you want to make sure you give yourself those little bit of self-care breaks, just to, be a human, give yourself a breath. And you want to make sure that you appreciate when you're doing tasks. You don't have to be perfect all the time. I think we feel like, especially a lot of us that became attorneys, we're very type A. Perfectionism is something I've struggled with. I talk about that a lot in my book. And, sometimes just giving yourself a little bit of grace can be really helpful. Which brings us to our next topic here, that whole idea of, self-compassion. And I like to look at it like this as an attorney. Can I be my inner ally instead of my inner enemy? And what I mean by that is, kind of go back to what we initially talked about, right? We are critical thinkers. Sometimes when things don't work out for us, right, and they're not going to work out perfectly every time, we can sort of turn that inward, right, onto ourselves. So that idea of really being more of an ally to yourself, and at the end of the day, I have a mug that says this, perfect is boring, right? We don't need to be perfect. And so one way that we can grow that skill, right, is really by having self-compassion. So, showing kindness to yourself, giving yourself that grace, and accepting yourself for who you are, imperfections and all. And so how do we do that? Because I know that, that can be difficult, and maybe it sounds a little woo-wooey or out there for you, but the truth of the matter is it really taps into, if you go back to my wheel of harmony, that attitude domain, which is really important. Right? So we can foster a positive mindset by journaling. It doesn't mean that you sit down with a journal every day, but if anyone on here liked to journal as a kid, it's something that you can kind of bring back into your life, which can be fun. I love reading stuff like from the past, but sometimes you just need to get something out and then you're done with it. If anybody wakes up in the middle of the night and you can't stop thinking about something, sometimes getting out of bed, going into a new space, and just kind of doing a little bit of a brain dump in a journal can be helpful. Also practicing gratitude. I love gratitude. I think it just really does make a difference, and in simple ways. You can get up in the morning or before you go to bed, write down 5 things you're grateful for. You can also just think on it. I have this in my morning meditations I do with some of my clients. And, one thing that can be fun with gratitude, especially if anyone on here has a family, have a gratitude jar in your kitchen. And each week, all the family members, everyone writes down one thing you're grateful for and you put it in a jar. And you're going to do 2 things. You're going to sit down to dinner and you're going to talk about it, right? And keep the phones away. And you're also going to, when you need a mental boost, just pick something out of the jar. It makes you feel happy. I've seen people do this with bulletin boards. We've done that a little bit in our office. Also go for a gratitude walk, right? We're getting into the nice time of year. It's the beginning of summer almost, right? So get outside and you just kind of, instead of, looking down at your phone, look around at all the beautiful natural things out there. You can also make it a scavenger hunt. I love doing pumpkins in the fall, maybe dogs. I'm a big dog person, or flowers in the spring, a certain color. And what is that going to do? It's putting me in the present moment, right? I think of mindfulness. I'm in the present moment. I'm not stressing about the past. I'm not thinking about the future. I'm just looking for, those golden retrievers that are out there. Also a gratitude object. Many of you probably are sitting in your offices. Maybe you've got your phone with you. I'm guessing you've got a gratitude trigger on it, right? A picture of something that makes you smile, makes you happy, whether that's, a pet, your family, a place that you love. Put more of those things around you in your work and home spaces, right? It might be pictures, a painting. When you travel, do you ever pick up fun little trinkets to have around, right? The more things we can put around us, the more we're going to boost our mood in that attitude domain. And really try more to engage in positive self-talk, right? So we really need to, challenge those negative thoughts, right? If something didn't happen great in court one day, or maybe you got into a fight with your spouse, make sure, like, instead of, going right away and beating yourself up, like, how can you replace those with more positive statements? Maybe this didn't work out, but you know what? I worked really hard and I did my absolute best. And sometimes, when I'm working with people on lifestyle goals, we learn the most when things don't go right sometimes, because then that gives us data how we can improve the next time. And then, having mantras, affirmations. I don't know if anybody's ever used a mantra. I'm a huge fan of them, especially around, having these SMART goals. I always have some kind of mantra on my bathroom mirror. I put it on a Post-it note. I'm currently grounded in positivity and lightness because I'm excited about just kind of being out there with my book. But anything that you can do that inspires you can really just kind of, over time, if you do it regularly, right, consistently, it can shift your mindset. And one of the other things we can really do individually is we can increase our emotional intelligence, right? So how individuals identify and manage their own emotions and react to the emotions of others. So this is a real big area, and some coaches that are in law firms spend a lot of time working on this with their associates, because we really need to, practice observing how we feel and behave in different situations. And that really becomes being more mindful of it. So question your opinions about a situation and reframe. A perfect way to think about this is you're going in to have a meeting with your boss or with your colleague, and they don't look very happy, right? They're in a bad mood. And what's the first reaction many of us have is, oh goodness, what did I do? We have no idea. We might not have done anything, right? That individual may have woken up on the wrong side of the bed. They didn't sleep good. They got in a fight with their, partner when they left the house. They might have an injury. Too overwhelmed, who knows, right? But we always take those things personally. So that's important not to do. And also, don't overlook the positive things in a situation. Even if something doesn't turn out exactly how you want, what can you learn from it? And, what are some positive aspects of it too? And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to spend a little bit of time today talking as a whole about our legal community. And, how can I look at it like this, how can we advance community in the legal workplace? As I mentioned, when we were looking at my wheel of harmony, that community is a big part of that. So how can we bring that idea into the legal spaces? One of the things that's being talked about a lot right now in our community is that idea of bullying. So the Illinois Supreme Court Commission on Professionalism recently did a survey, bullying in the legal profession, and they found that 1 out of every 4 Illinois lawyers recounts being bullied. Between 2022, 2023, the American Bar Association is really into this. In fact, in the ABA Journal, this is the cover story right now. And why is this so important? Well, we know that it really does impact our emotional health, our physical health. It also, makes our work production not as good. It impacts people's self-confidence. And one of the worst things that's coming out of this is there's a lot of people leaving our profession because of it, right? And we're going to lose a lot of talent if this is not something that we can, kind of move past, and at least begin to talk about, which I think is great. So for our next polling question, I would like to know, what can lawyers do to advance, be more of an advocate in their organizations, right? So lawyers in leadership roles should speak up in the workplace. Legal workplaces should enforce anti-bullying policies and conduct real training, right? Real training, not just by ourselves on a computer, but actually talk to each other. Be an ally and mentor lawyers who are navigating challenging situations, or nothing. We were hazed, we were bullied. It's part of what it's like to be in our profession. So I'm curious what people think that we can do as leaders in the profession to really help with this, because it's something that lawyers, really of all ages are struggling with, but, a lot of which, are younger attorneys that are coming into our office spaces. And so it looks like there's a lot of people that think, being leaders is helpful, being allies is helpful. And I think that's all really important because, all of these things do is they advance our profession when we can come together, more productively. And so a few other ideas besides those that I had were, how can we really build an idea of community? Well, we can empathetically listen to colleagues and appreciate generational differences. So I, loved growing up To Kill a Mockingbird. And when Atticus tells Scout, his daughter, sometimes you've got to walk around in someone else's skin or in their shoes and see how it feels. I really think that's what empathy is, right? It doesn't mean we agree with our colleague that's saying something, but can we understand where they're coming from and their point of view? And really consider those generational differences. And I think a lot of this comes down to communication styles. When I go in and I work with firms, I'll hear all the time, maybe some of the younger attorneys want to, do stuff more always on technology, right? Whereas maybe some of the older attorneys, they would rather have a face-to-face conversation or pick up the telephone call. These are all things that we can work out in our organizations if we just talk to each other. Because we've got 4 different generations right now in our profession. We can also recognize our own biases and actively work to challenge them. Sometimes, that comes up. We assume somebody is going to be a certain way and they're not. And then, of course, we can engage in team building activities. I'm as a wellness person, I'm such a big promoter of this. You can do a wellness challenge. You can just sit and eat lunch together. I came into my conference room last week and there was a team in here that was just sitting eating lunch together. And I was like, that's really cool. I like that they're all just kind of hanging out and talking. We can attend firm-sponsored events. I actually took our office on Tuesday to the chopping block, and we cooked a really fun Italian meal together. And it was just a really nice team-building activity. It was something fun outside the office. But I really think those little things go a long way in promoting a really nice environment inside the day-to-day work, which sometimes we all know can be a bit of a grind. And another thing that we can do is really increase our community and social interactions. So, as much as we do, work within these spaces, making sure for our own mental health that we stay connected to family, friends, build new relationships. We can increase our community involvement. There's so many ways in our profession to do that, whether that's being part of bar organizations, philanthropic boards. I know I'm on a few with tons of lawyers, which is so fun to meet people from different offices. Book clubs. Book clubs are huge right now. Sports leagues. We have one of my partners here. He is in a hockey sports league, and he has such a fun, time with, exercises, has a really good time, has met some fun people. In masterminds, there's tons of masterminds coming up on different subjects. Maybe this is even something that you want to host sometime and get a group of women lawyers together or men lawyers together and kind of do, kind of talk about the challenges, right, in the profession that we face. Also, using those professional supports. The Lawyers Assistance Program is amazing. I love the program in Illinois as well as in other states. And I think sometimes we forget about that. And I always like to mention that when I'm doing a program because, you don't need to go there when you're really struggling. Sometimes if we're just like, we feel like we're a little too stressed out, maybe we're on the cusp of something or we're trying to figure out a decision to make. Maybe it's even a career decision. You don't know if you want to stay where you're at. There's so many great confidential resources there. So always remember, to take advantage of that, if you need it. And another way that we can really advance, the community in our profession is by contribution and paying it forward into the world, right? This is another domain in that wheel of harmony. So psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, he believed that when human beings contributed to future generations and they, the world around them, that they gained higher satisfaction and they really left behind a true legacy. So, when we talk about legacy, part of that is contributing to the world. So what are some great ways that lawyers can do that? So lawyers can do that by mentoring other lawyers. There are so many young lawyers who love being mentored. I know in every stage of my life, whether it was, in the legal space or in the wellness space, I've benefited so much from mentoring, and I definitely still have mentors in my life. And, now I'm trying to be that, right, for people as well. I'm volunteering in legal and neighborhood communities. There's a lot of pro se things that we can do. Also, organizing firm advocacy. I love when I'll see pop up on social, one of the law firms I follow is all out volunteering or has a clothing drive or something around the holidays. Those are great ways, and they make you feel good to spread that, to the world. Also, coaching sports teams, teaching classes, right? There's a lot of adjunct teachers over at the law schools, advocating for personal causes. So there's so many ways as lawyers individually and as part of our firms and organizations, we really can, contribute to the world. And so for the last part of the program, before we get to questions, I want to talk a little bit about non-negotiable self-care. This is something that is really important to me. I think it's something that we all need to find simple avenues to get into our daily lives. And so the first thing that I want to ask is, and there's a reason I'm asking it like this, I have a polling question. I would like to know, what is your go-to self-care non-negotiable that you consistently incorporate into your routine? Another way to think about this, I only have time to do one thing. What are you going to do here? Right? Is it exercise? Is it that healthy nutrition? Is it mindfulness practices, or is it sleep hygiene? Right? These are all great things that we can be doing for our self-care. But what is your one thing you're like, this is my non-negotiable, I have to do it? So it looks like we have right away, we have a lot of exercise, we have a lot of sleep hygiene happening, we've got some healthy nutrition, mindfulness practices. And the reason I'm asking this is, sometimes when we're really busy, I'll ask people, what is your jam? If you've got to turn it around, you feel like I've got to get some self-care, and what's your jam? For instance, I travel a lot to do speaking engagements. And when I'm kind of on the road, I'm out of my regular routine, right? I can't get everything done. But for me, I always travel with my exercise bands, because I know that I've at least got to move a little bit, even if it's, it might not be my hour workout. It just might be 15, 20 minutes, like 2 days out of the week that I'm gone. But just doing that, really helps me, not just physically, but mentally. So whatever you picked here, when you feel like you need a little bit of something, right? That's just kind of turn things around for you. Maybe you're in your office, you're having a really bad day. Is there something in that vein you can go to, right? And for those of you who picked sleep, right? Maybe that's the thing. Okay, that night I better make sure I get my sleep in. And remember it this way, because some of this is really about changing our mindsets. The oxygen mask rule. When we fly, that flight attendant says you got to put your oxygen mask on first before you assist other people. So I need to do that in my everyday life, because I'm not going to be not only not going to be at my best for myself, I'm also not going to be there for my clients and colleagues, for my families, for my friends, for all those other organizations maybe I'm involved in. Because at the end of the day, if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to burn out, right? That's just eventually going to happen to all of us. So it's important that we can find just small avenues to get that in. And so you might be saying to yourself, how can I do that? One good way is by creating those daily routines, right? Routines are great. They serve as your self-care base. When you need to pivot, you've got space to do that, right? So if I've got a routine in place when I go on vacation, when I'm on trial and I have a really busy week, or I just kind of fall off track because stuff's happened in my life, I've got something to come back to. So it's really important we have those morning routines. What are you doing when you get up to kind of set the positive tone for the day? Are you able to get a little, break, during your day? And when you come home, what do you do to unwind? I always tell people, when you get home, change clothes, go for a walk. Why? Because I'm mentally kind of resetting where I'm at. It doesn't mean I never look at my phone ever again, but I am in a totally different space when I get home than I was when I'm sitting in my conference room today in my office. And so find avenues to incorporate what I like to call pockets of self-care. So you want to give yourself at least 10 minutes a day of this non-negotiable self-care. It adds up to 70 minutes a week. And how can you get this back? If you're like, you know what, Erin, I don't have 10 minutes every day. Well, one thing is, can we limit social media and online scrolling? If you actually paid attention to that, you probably would get more than 10 minutes back. You know, how often are you looking on social media? You know, or looking at your email. This happens to me. A store I like Alo Yoga or something, will pop up, and then I click on it, right? I'm wasting time doing those things, where I could be doing something in the self-care realm that's a little bit more productive. So good ways to get that back. Practice that time management we talked about, and really shift your mindset. You know, it's about giving yourself that oxygen. It's really important. And for those of you who are really into, you know, I've got to stay productive at work, you know, maybe there's some leaders of firms on here right now, and you're like, man, I want to make sure my employees stay focused. Well, there's a lot of new research coming out. And they use the term snack breaks, right, instead of pockets of self-care. But the idea is, if you give yourself 5 to 10 minutes of, you know, a snack break. So whether that's, you know, going for a walk, you know, just meditating, sitting in the quiet, you know, having, you know, something healthy to eat, and you're not looking at your screen, whatever it is that you do, we know that you are going to be 30% more productive when you sit back down. That makes sense, right? If I am just sitting at my computer for hours and hours working on a brief, and I do not give myself a break at some point, my mind is not going to be functioning at the same capacity. So that's also from a performance standpoint. Well, we want to make sure we're giving ourselves these little breaks throughout the day. And so what are some avenues that you can do that? So I'm just highlighting a couple of my favorite things in those lifestyle areas that I had to do a poll on. So of course we have exercise. You know, people always ask about exercise. Exercise is not just good for your physical health, right? It's good for disease prevention, but it's also good for for our mental health too. You know, think about, you know, Legally Blonde. You know, Elle Woods tells you that you've got to have, you know, exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. That is actually really true when we look at the research. So we want to make sure we get a combination of cardio, strength training in, right? Cardio gives, you know, years to your life, right? Think of your heart, while strength training gives life to your years. I want to be able to walk up and down the stairs, get on the floor with my kids, carry my groceries. But how can you kind of get that in, right? So you can stretch or do yoga when you get out of bed in the morning. If you've got no time to do anything else, you know, just kind of doing a little something when you get out of bed is a great way to get it in. You can go for a walk during the workday. Again, we're kind of in the nicer months now. You know, even just getting, you know, taking that snack break for 10 minutes, walking around the block. And you can also do, right, strength training, workout on a fitness app. There's so many different avenues to get exercise in, but don't think you always have to go to a gym, because when you are active every day in your life, just, you know, walking to and from the train station, riding your bike somewhere, parking in the last spot, taking the stairs, gardening, all these different, playing with your kids, all these things add up to exercise, right? They might not necessarily meet whatever your goal is, but from a health standpoint, this is all counts as exercise, right? Back in the day, people did not have gyms, right? They had to find other ways to have exercise. And so if we've got to exercise, we also want to make sure we eat healthy. So that's nutrition. So, you know, eat a protein-rich meal or snack away from technology is a simple, you know, pocket of self-care that you can do. Want to make sure we've got protein, right? It's good for our muscles as we age. It also is good for cravings throughout the day to give us energy. Refill your water bottle. You know, just drinking, if you do one thing, I just sent out before I got on here, I'm going to do a little nutrition challenge with my office. And these are a few of the tips on it. I have, everyone's going to pick one habit, right? But water, you know, have that, you know, 8+ glasses of water a day is great. Also, pack healthy meals and snacks with you for work, right? So instead of eating out, you'll save money too, right? Packing some healthy meals and snacks. And then of course we have mindfulness. You can practice mindfulness by pausing in your day, right? Even just taking 3 deep breaths is helpful. You know, put on a face mask and listen to soothing music. One of the judges told me that she does this, but she also puts some hand mitts on so she can't look at her phone, right? So kind of getting away from that technology. And be creative. Some of the best ways to practice mindfulness, if anyone liked to do art as a kid, they have awesome coloring books for adults. You can, color, you can draw, paint, write. I love to cook. For me, it's such a mindful activity and it's very creative. And then sleep, right? We want to make sure we get our sleep in. Ideally, we need 7 to 9 hours a night. I know sometimes that's hard, for lawyers, especially if you're on trial and have stuff going on. There is some new research that says if you can do 5 hours consistently and get good sleep, that can be helpful. But what can you do to, get to bed, right? Obviously, read a book instead of hopping on the laptop, take a shower to cool off your body. I also love too, if anybody struggles with sleep, because it is so important, writing in a sleep journal can be helpful in terms of tracking patterns. Of course, we have the Aura rings and things like that, but if you don't know what behaviors are impacting your sleep, or maybe what emotions you're going through are impacting your sleep, you're not going to learn that from an electronic tracker necessarily. And before we get into questions, I just want to end too by noting that, it's really important that you make time for the things that bring you joy. So these are all the things that, I really love to do. I love to cook. I love to spend time with my family, especially my husband, John. We love to travel. It's my dog, Daisy. I love being able to come and talk to wellness, talk about wellness with all of you. So really making time for these things and just putting this collage together for me is very much a gratitude trigger, if you will. And always remember that, we spend a third of our life either sleeping or attempting to do so. So what you do with the other 2/3 is up to you. So when you're thinking about building out your wheel of harmony, what your values are that are important to you, really think about that and take that to heart. Yes, we've got these careers, but you also want to make sure that you're building out a life that you love, because we have all these other things that are important to us too. And so we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. So I know some of you have been putting them in the chat. Pam is going to fuel them to me.
Right, we have loads of questions coming in. So I'm going to try to get through as many as I can with you, Erin. First of all, Rebecca's asking, how do you do a wellness challenge?
So what I've been doing in our office, just to make it easy, is I have everybody pick, I ask everyone to get involved, so the staff, the lawyers, and everybody picks one habit that they want to work on for 6 weeks. And we create a private Facebook group. I give everyone a habit tracker, a paper tracker. And so, for instance, somebody might say, I want to exercise for 30 minutes 3 times a week, or I want to drink 8 glasses of water every day. And they track that over the 6 weeks. And then I put together like a fun little celebration. Happy to share some stuff with anyone if they email me. For this summer, I'm doing a nutrition challenge. So the same idea, but I came up with 15 different like healthy nutrition habits, and everyone's just going to pick one. But this is a fun way in an office because it builds collegiality, but also everyone gets to work on something that they want to work on, as opposed to me just saying, hey, everyone has to do these 1 or 2 things.
Great. And then Mary is asking, can you recommend a book or podcast that'll help people who have issues for setting and sticking to boundaries, particularly because of a history of decades of trying to please people and second guessing yourself?
I mean, I think, one thing that's helpful, obviously one book that comes to mind is I spent a lot of time in my book, Wellness Reimagined, talking about boundaries. I'm trying to think of another book. If I will get back to Mary because let me think about it a little bit. There's a boundaries book that I used when I was working on my master's degree, sitting in my office, but I do not remember the author. But it's all about boundaries, and it has a whole workbook attached to it. Because I think remember with boundaries, one thing that's important is, just like if I was going to train for a marathon, I have to practice, right? I have to train for it. When it comes to boundaries, you have to practice too. Because it's really emotional sometimes to set and create boundaries. So I think sometimes having some exercises around that can be helpful. So if Pam wants to get Mary's contact, I can get back to you.
Yes, I have it here. And many people are asking, actually, where can they get your book? that just came out that's on the bestsellers list? Where are they able
Yeah,
to find
so
it or buy it?
yeah, so my book Wellness Reimagined is available. It's available on Amazon and all your major retailers. If you go on my website, we have a link and you can click on it.
Great. And then Sherry's asking, can you go over some of the breathing techniques to reduce stress and to help you get to sleep?
Sure. One of my favorite breathing techniques to actually just reduce stress. Let's start with that one. Is really what I like to call, it's called the calming breath. When I was taking a training on meditation for a couple of weeks, they gave us a bunch of exercises, and I think this one works really well. And it's simple. So you breathe in for 2, you hold your breath for 3, and you blow out your lips like you're blowing out a candle for 4. So if you do that cycle at least 4 times, what it does is that specific breath calms your nervous system. Another one that people really like is box breathing, which they do a lot in the Navy and the military. They'll do box breathing. And if you Google any of these, like they have videos and stuff like that. I also like at night to do a counting breath because it sort of reminds me of that concept of counting sheep. So, if you're laying in bed with your eyes closed, you breathe in for 1 and out for 1. In for 2, out for 2. And then you go all the way up to 10. And then when you get to 10, you count back down. So 10, 9, 8, back to 1. And you do that back and forth until you fall asleep. So those are 3 of my favorite breathing techniques.
Terrific. And Miles is asking, what is your suggestion to handle pressures for younger lawyers in a law firm?
One of the things that I think can be helpful, because I know when you're a younger lawyer, you're trying to build your business and your brand, right? And you want to make sure you're doing, enough and kind of getting noticed. So I think it can be helpful to, have some self-care, even if it's those little pockets of self-care or snack breaks in your day. I think finding a mentor is really important. Is there somebody in your organization that you think can be an ally for you, that you can kind of help you navigate the culture of your office? It can also be helpful to have a mentor too. If there's nobody in your office, like outside your firm, that's older and a little bit more experienced, that can help you navigate things. I think we really learn together, from our communities, and also feeling, like you can speak up too. I know that can be hard, but sometimes when we, if we get into a situation at work and we feel like we're sort of lower on the totem pole, if you will, because we're an associate, and it's something with a partner, is there somebody that can kind of help you navigate, that situation? And also making sure that you talk to people. Do you have like confidants in your life that you can talk to? Do you feel like, maybe I need to go to the lawyer's assistance program and talk to somebody? I think we get in trouble a lot when we hold things in. So, again, kind of making sure you've got some kind of avenues of an outlet, for self-care, making sure you've got a mentor or 2 that can kind of help guide you, and sometimes just getting involved in a bar organization, joining the Young Lawyers Division can really help finding some mentors as well. And then, feeling like you can reach out, I think it's brave to reach out to somebody if you are struggling.
Very good. And you spoke earlier of one's North Star, and Robert is asking, can you give your top 5 recommendations of one's values?
Well, I think to me, that's an interesting question, because I think values, they're so individual, so I would encourage Robert, if I was working with you, what is at this point in your life, what are your top priorities? What's really important to you? Right. I mean, and if you go actually on my website and you type in values, I actually have my values activity on there, or if you email me, I can send it to you. But I really like to go through, I have a whole list of values. And what I like people to do is sit and look at this list. I have this in my book as well. And, you kind of go through the list, you get rid of half of them, you narrow it down to 10, you narrow it down to 5. But values should be something that are important to you. I just got asked a question. I was on a podcast and somebody asked me, in this world, she was younger, and she's like, in this world of social media, how do I know these are my values and not the values I'm just seeing somebody else have? And I thought that was a really powerful, interesting question. So it has to be the things that I look at it, what brings you fulfillment? What's going to bring you joy? Another way to look at it is, what does success look like to you? I can walk around this office right now with all the trial lawyers in here, and if I really sat down and asked them and started probing them, I'm going to get different answers, because success isn't just, in my mind, success isn't just about, are we really great in our career, right? That's one area. But for a lot of people, they also have, other things like their health, their families, maybe there's spirituality, maybe there's personal development, all these different areas, where if they can build them out, they find success. So when you think about your values, really think about, what do I want my life to look like? How am I going to, what fills my soul? How am I going to feel fulfilled? Because it's really going to look different to everyone. And if anyone on here is, like, I don't know what my top 5 values, I would encourage you to just sit down and think about it, or, kind of go through my values exercise or some questions in there. But it's really, it should be so individualized, because if it's not what you want and what you need, you're not going to end up being fulfilled.
And I'm going to start combining a couple questions because we only have a few minutes left. Stephen is asking, how important is it to separate yourself from the profession when you leave the office? And Alexander is asking, how do you avoid a mental burnout?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, to kind of combine those, I think it's good to, like, have other things in your life other than the law, which I think can really help too with that whole mental burnout. If I am constantly just lawyer, work, even if I like my job, right, as some of us do, that's going to eventually cause me to burn out. I've got to have other avenues in my life. So, when you leave the office, can you go home and change clothes and do something non-lawyer related? And don't be afraid, or when you go out with your friends, because I actually have a lot of friends that are attorneys, right? Because that's who I hang out with a lot. But like, when I go out I have a group of girlfriends and we're all lawyers. When we go out to dinner, like, we're not talking about work. Like, we're talking about, like, personal stuff, or we're gossiping, or we're talking about, TV shows we're watching. So I would encourage you, when you are out with, other lawyers, to kind of talk about other topics, but also to have these other outlets that you like. Maybe I know some attorneys that love to go to Second City and take improv classes, or maybe you like to paint. Maybe you just like to go home and read a book on a fiction book and cuddle up with your dog. But, finding other avenues when we leave the office or even on the weekends, if you don't have, that you can really, like, tap into, or hobbies that have nothing to do with the law. And hobbies are very individualistic. What do you like to do? What did you like to do growing up? If I said you could do anything you want, what would you pick? Kind of thinking about adding some of those things in, because when we do things outside of work that are meaningful for us, I think that can help with the burnout too.
With 1 minute left, we have Cynthia asking, I'm going to combine here too, if you could discuss technology boundaries like phones and computers. But Anthony is also asking, how do you think AI will be affecting human wellness?
I mean, I think, with with the AI stuff, we'll see what happens, right? I'm kind of a little nervous about it, because I think on one hand, I think it can be helpful, right? There's cool tools that we get as humans, and probably as lawyers. There's already some kind of coming out with AI. But I also think it's good, to rely on to rely on ourselves and others. And, one thing that worries me a little bit is, you kind of hear these things where somebody, is like, I'm spending a lot of time talking to my AI assistant, who's now become my friend. And I think if it's a resource for you, that's great. But I also think we need to have connections outside of our phones and outside of our computers. And so, that's one thing I would encourage people. There's nothing, I had a meeting with somebody yesterday, and he came over to the office, and he said to me, thanks for meeting me in person. I'm tired of always being on Zoom. And I agree with that, because I think we lose stuff when it's just, always on the computer or always on our phones. And so that's, I think, one avenue. I worry a little bit about AI. So it's not that we shouldn't use it, because I'm sure there's gonna be tools I'm gonna want to use, right? But, still, like, trying to still stay connected to, like, real people, I think could be helpful too. And, when it comes to those technology boundaries, I just think being upfront, and sometimes that takes practice, being very clear with, your coworkers or your family members of when you're available, using those, resources like that do not disturb, putting things in your email signage. And if you feel really anxious about this, or maybe you work somewhere, you're like, I don't know how that would go over, be like, hey, if it's an emergency, pick up the phone and call me. Otherwise, I may not be available on my phone because I'm, at home after hours. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And, maybe everybody, as my therapist likes to tell me, Erin, sometimes when you enforce your boundaries, not everyone's going to like you, and that's okay. Because at the end of the day, you've got to take care of yourself. And, I know in this profession it can seem difficult sometimes, but I do think if we can implement, a little bit more self-care, having a little bit more boundaries, living with our values and the life domains that are important to us, we can really find ways to, have some harmonious lawyering and really navigate this profession and this world in a way that we can make it work for us.
Well, Erin and everyone who's attending, we're actually a little past 4 o'clock and we have the full hour. So everyone here at Clifford Law Offices, particularly Erin Clifford, would like to thank you for attending, and that ends our program for this afternoon.
Thank you for attending today's program. A link to the certification process will now appear on your screen. Please take the time to request your certificate as soon as possible. This link will also be emailed to you tomorrow morning. From all of us here at Clifford Law Offices, wishing you good health.